I'm going to talk to you about the subject of strategy. And let me tell you, I'm very nervous about doing that always, because although I've been working strategy and strategic issues for 22 years, I was raised as an operator in the Army, in airborne and reconnaissance units. And I know that operators are always tapping their watch, you know. Yeah, thanks strategy 100 years from now, but, you know, I got to get the troops on the truck. So I'm aware of the fact that I'm talking about strategy and effects over the next 100 years, and some people in this audience got cows to feed this afternoon. So, but let me just set this concept of strategy as the construct, because an awful lot of what you have achieved, and boy, the last 30 minutes is a great list of achievements. An awful lot of it is at the tactical level. How do we maneuver on a daily basis? And what you're trying to do is lay tracks into the future. So let's talk just for a minute about what strategy means. I would argue that it is a concept of cause and effect. You see people talk about my strategy is, and it's in a book, and we have a national strategy. It's a concept. It's an idea. If we do A, then B will happen. That's what a strategy is. And if you get away from that, cause and effect, then you are no longer in the realm of strategy. You're in tactics or operations or something else. To achieve victory. And victory is very important, because it's amazing how many people launch out on a project assuming they know what they want to achieve and get to the end and aren't sure what they're willing to pay or what they want to achieve. Here's my definition of victory. Military victory, diplomatic victory, economic victory, your victory. Getting what you're willing to accept at a price you're willing to pay. All politics, whether it's military conflict or politics in a local homeowners association, is about trading views and trade-offs. You know, the chances you will ever be in a disagreement with someone and they will slap their head and say, geez, democracy, why didn't we think of that? Of course, that's not what opponents do. You must figure out what's the minimum you'll accept and what's the most you're willing to pay, and you better figure that out going in, because what happens, and remember strategy, my background is in the military, but what happens is you get dragged further and further down the road to paying more and more and accepting less and less, unless you go in with a clear understanding of who your opponents might be and what it is you want to achieve. Now, I have up here against the thinking enemy, and of course, remember my background. In your case, you may not have a thinking enemy, but let me tell you, you will have thinking opponents. You have people who have other positions, other things that they want achieved, and they are trying as hard to unwrap your strategy as you are trying to put it together. And you have to keep that in mind. At the end, if you want to, we'll talk about a couple of books that offer some very good ideas for building consensus and moving forward. And then the last point, over time. If you want to know what we can do this afternoon in our next legislative session, then probably I'm not the right guy. So be patient for the next 30 minutes, and you'll find somebody today that does want to talk about that. My construct is for the future. How you turn things around over time and get them moving in your direction over time. Let me give you just one or two quick examples of strategy so we got the context for the day. Today is the 70th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. Japan and the United States had radically different strategies for the Second World War. The Japanese strategy was, if we can strike the Americans and destroy their fleet and take their outpost in the Philippines, then they will see that the war is so expensive that they will figure it's not worth the price, and they will back out of Asia and let us have China and the resources of Southeast Asia to ourselves. That was their strategy. And by the way, it had worked 40 years earlier against Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. That was their strategy. The American strategy was, we have to eliminate this threat permanently. We are going to build a set of bases for airfields across the Pacific until we can reach the Japanese homeland, where we will invade and change their form of government. Two quite different strategies, which took place over time. So that's what I mean by strategy. Now let me move on and maybe find a little easier way to introduce to you. I do appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. The first question I would offer to you is, why me? I feel a little like Admiral Stockdale. Remember when he ran with Ross Perot and interviewed to be the vice president? He started off by saying, who am I? Why am I here? And then he couldn't answer the question. Who am I and why am I here? Because I've spent the last 22 years working on this issue of strategy and how you apply strategic concepts to different subjects. In the last 5 or 6 months, I've worked on the subject of risk management for the Department of Homeland Security. I did a white paper for them. I'm going back next week to brief them on how they are using and misusing risk and a new strategy for using risk within the Department of Homeland Security. I worked with the WMD Center to release a report card on U.S. biopreparedness that went out in October of this year. How do we craft a new strategy to better prepare America for biological events, whether they're attacks or naturally occurring events? Last week I met with some folks to talk about crafting strategies for cyber defense and strategies for education for the Border Patrol. So what I'm going to try to do for about the next 20 minutes or so is talk to you about how to craft a strategy, how to think about strategies in your terms. And now the question is, why today? Why us? Why are we meeting here today? And what I'm going to suggest to you is that you're facing an era of new challenges and you need to do a new thing. The hardest thing a human being can do. The hardest thing a human being can do. You have to create a new idea. In the educational community, everything up to the PhD level, everything up to the dissertation is an expanded version of your first fourth grade book report. Everything you do. In the fourth grade, you write one paragraph in a book. You read it, you analyze it, you write a topic sentence, a concluding sentence, and 3 supporting sentences that explain what the book is about. And you do that for your 6th grade big paper, and you do that at the end of high school. You do that for every paper as an undergraduate. You do that at the master's level. You do that for every class at the PhD level. When you get to your dissertation, the thing that makes a PhD different, the thing that makes Western education different, the secret to the success of the Western world for the last several hundred years in the education area is that the dissertation requires the person to think a thought no one has thought before. That's what a dissertation does. It is extremely difficult. And what we're about today is trying to think about new ways for you to apply your very fine arguments about the importance of private ownership in land to a new circumstance, new situations. And those are the things that that's what I'm going to try to do here for the next few minutes. Does private ownership and management of agricultural land and resources contribute to national security and homeland security development? Now, you're not going to answer that question. We're not going to answer that in the next 15 minutes. We are going to start a dialogue. And the next thing that's going to happen is you're going to become very uncomfortable with the language. And that's what my slides are about today, trying to explain to you what terms you need to use to explain your arguments in those terms. It's a start point. It's not a solution. But here's why we're at this place. I would suggest to you, this is my concept, that we're in kind of the 4th tier of revolutions in agriculture. And the first revolution was where agriculture shaped civilizations and community powers. And we read history of militaries and empires that come and go. And, my background, I look at military history, but the truth is that the sword and the shield have been much less important in the rise and fall of empires than has been wheat, corn, oats, grains, livestock. The ability to feed a people has always been the core of a nation or a state's strength. And military might has been about protecting that or expanding either the area for agriculture or the number of people who can do agriculture. Because the more military you have in the old world, the fewer people you had to raise crops. And so you needed some other people, whether they were slaves or other people in nearby communities. That world gave way in the late 1700s, early 1800s to the next revolution in agriculture, which was private ownership. Because here's the truth, you know it, you work harder for what you own than you do for what somebody else owns. You know, I can always tell the manager of a fast food restaurant. You know why? Because they're the one who picks up the trash in the parking lot. The person who owns and has an investment takes better care of it than the person who is a tenant, whether it's a tenant farmer or a tenant worker. And so we got a revolution in private ownership. There's been a big political movement in the last couple of years to go back to see what the Founding Fathers said. Let's read the Federalist Papers. Let's read the Constitution. I think it's at least as important to read what the Founding Fathers were reading. And they were reading John Locke. And John Locke, the English philosopher, said the foundation of all rights is private ownership. It is more important than the right to vote. If you have private ownership, you eventually will build a society that allows votes. But if you start with a vote and no private ownership, people will simply vote to take away from people that own something. Private ownership becomes the foundation of agricultural productivity. And the second thing happens, by the way, in 1776. Now, you remember what it is? It has to do with private ownership? It's not our Declaration of Independence. It's a publication of Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. The foundation of the concept of capitalism. And that changes agricultural production and makes us more efficient and effective, leading really to a third wave that takes place about 100 years later, which is the industrialization of agriculture. Now, I don't mean the arrival of huge farms. I mean the application of engineering and science to agriculture, which drives the education of private owners. 1863 is the Morrill Act, when the United States Congress recognizes that we need to establish educational institutions that specialize in teaching agriculture and engineering. I think we have a representative here today from the first land-grant college, Kansas State. And that really comes to the fore about 20 years later in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, when Germany, Prussia actually at the time, and its little principalities, is able to field an army rapidly and overwhelm France, the greatest military power of the day. And Prussia is able to do that, and the world sits up and takes notice because they did three things. First of all, they had advances in agriculture, which allowed them to raise more crops and feed more people with fewer people. Secondly, they had advances in engineering, which allowed them to create better weapons and railroads that moved their troops more rapidly than the French could. And thirdly, they approached education as the education of the military as a military science, and they created the reserves, so they didn't have to have a huge standing army. They could train people, and they could stand up rapidly and go to war. What did the land-grant colleges focus on? Agriculture, engineering, and military science. They created the foundation of the strength of the United States overseas for the next 150 years. When I talk about crafting a strategy, that's what I'm talking about. The land-grant universities, the land-grant colleges created the modern agricultural world, created the modern military world, created the power of the United States. And if we have a problem today in agriculture that everybody sort of accepts that it's going to be there, it's because they were so successful in the late 1800s in crafting a strategy to create this world we live in today. And that leaves us now in this fourth evolution or revolution, the information age, where things are happening dramatically to affect you. Some of those are technological advances that improve the breeding of cattle, that improve the growth in agriculture, the specific development of strains, action against diseases. Some of it also has to do, however, with information that other people have. And I'll tell you, I think that the anti-capitalist wing of the environmental movement, not all environmentalists, I'm one, the anti-capitalist wing of the environmental movement has gotten inside sort of the decision cycle of landowners, property owners, people that believe in ownership of property. They are moving more quickly in the information age than we are. And that's an issue we've got to come to face. So all of this leads to the question of how do you build new concepts to contribute, to connect to other aspects of the nation and for sustainment, and to build community power. Remember the guy who said, I always thought this business about the, now I've lost the term, the trust for environmental trust? I thought that was a communist plot. I put up community, and a lot of people say, community organizers, communist plot. No, sir. What I'm telling you is that today the language you're going to have to use is the language of how we build a whole of community effort in the United States. Give me about 5 or 6 more minutes here with a couple of slides. I'll show you why. Here's the language of national security strategy. If you're going to make the argument that the private ownership of land is directly connected to the security of the United States, you will have to learn, or you will have to create and assist educational organizations that teach this language. What is a nation? It's a collection of people that share the same values. Kurds are a nation. They aren't a state. What is a state? It is a political organization with a boundary that can protect itself, raise taxes, enforce its laws. What is a nation state? It is the fusing of those two things, and it is extremely powerful. We have lived in a nation state, people who share the same values and have a political structure. Those can be very strong. They are threatened today by a number of outside forces. Here's the way that national security strategists think about the world. These next two, this one set of bullets is the terminology they move in. These are the terms of art. You must craft your argument in these terms to be successful on their playing field. First of all, what is national security? It is about projecting and protecting national power to protect national interests. What are national interests? They fall into categories: survival, vital, and important. Survival are those interests that if you don't protect them, the nation collapses. Energy is a survival interest for the United States. If you want to argue that food is a survival interest for the United States, you're going to have to explain to people how it might be threatened or go away. Everybody gets it about energy. You've been so successful the last 150 years, nobody gets it about food. An important issue is one that's so important that if it got worse, it becomes a vital interest. You might want to argue that food's very important. It's not yet vital, but it's extremely important. You need to use that language. And then there are vital interests, are those that become survival if unattended. Important issues are those that rise to the public consciousness. They deserve attention. They deserve some funding, but they're never going to have to do with the destiny of the nation. So you need to figure out which of these areas your concept of land ownership and private land falls within. Do you think it's a survival interest for the nation? Is it a vital interest? We have to maintain this, and explain why. Then you need to think about national power. What are the elements of national power? This is the language that's used. This is the currency of thought in the field of national security. The acronym is DIIMED, DIME or DIMED. First of all, diplomacy. Washington, D.C. thinks in these terms. States don't. And there's a great temptation to come to a capital like this and talk to the legislature like this and look at a state of Texas with this expanse in 254 counties and think what a great and powerful state we are and how important we are in the national playing field. The Texas budget for this year will about equal the budget for health for the Department of Defense. Not health for the nation, just health for just the Department of Defense. No tanks, no airplanes, no aircraft carriers. State budgets on the national scale are relatively small. You're going to have to craft different arguments and different languages to play on the national scale, I would argue. Diplomacy is extremely important. How might agriculture and private ownership promote our leverage of diplomacy overseas? And we can talk about that, and there are a number of ways. One of the most successful things the Department of State has advanced is the idea of micro-lending. That is, if they can just get $20 or $50 to a lot of people in other countries to buy a sewing machine, then a woman in India can start a small business that grows and grows and grows. That is now placed as a high priority within the Department of State. What about agriculture and its development and private ownership is placed within the Department of State? The answer is there are some things there. The Borlaug Institute, for example, has a bunch of Iraqi farmers at Texas A&M being educated, but I'm suggesting to you, take your arguments, place them in the context of diplomacy and expanding American power overseas if you want them to succeed on a national scale. Intelligence and information, I won't do each one of these in detail. If you want to, we can talk about it later. But the idea of who is producing what overseas and how can we compare that to what we're doing and how can we do it better, that becomes critical to the question of how do we become more efficient, more effective, and create economic power for the United States. Let me skip right quick to the question of domestic power, which almost no one really looks at. We have a whole infrastructure that looks at national security and how you craft national power to be used overseas. We haven't really looked at how you build a nation internally. It's not a subject the federal government in the past has addressed because until recently, it's not been any of their doggone business. How the people craft that. The Department of State is engaged in that question. What makes a nation work? And they're engaged in the office that looks at how you build other states. How do you bring Iraq back? How do you create Afghanistan into a functioning democracy? What do we do to help out Somalia and African nations? And the answer is you have to think through how all these things fit together. If there's a single place you could go to in the federal government and find a purchase where maybe you could make the argument about the value of individual ownership and how that promotes agricultural development, I think it's within the Department of State. You just have to find the right levers. That's why understanding this language is so important. So, what's the question we need to think about? How do you create new concepts to contribute to connectivity and to community power using this language? And I'm saying contribution because the era of I'm important, let me find a way to work my way to the top of the line and get ahead of other folks, it will never go away, but that is increasingly in jeopardy as budget cuts get bigger and bigger and bigger. You're going to have to argue not why they need to take care of you because you vote for them. Everybody's arguing that. You need to argue why and how you contribute to the power of the nation as a whole. Let me put all this I think I got 2 more slides. Let's put all this in Homeland Security, Homeland Defense context, and not just a national context. So what is Homeland Security? Very interesting. A lot of people talk about it, and almost nobody asks this question. It's the protection of securing the people and resources of the nation against a disaster or attack, but it's of the nation. Homeland Security and private public safety are not the same thing. Now, this is confused in our minds because police and fire, who are public safety, also do the Homeland Security mission at the local level. But Homeland Security funding, Homeland Security strategies, Homeland Security attention in the Congress are on those things that have a national impact, not that have a local impact. If there is a tornado in Austin, it is the business of the Austin mayor and city council. If it's more than they can handle, it's the business of this county. If it's more than this county can handle, it's the business of this state. And unless the state can handle it, it's not an issue for the federal government. And that's quite different from the way we think about national issues overseas. So Homeland Security, if you want to play a part in this, it's about how do you serve the nation as a whole and the needs for the nation as a whole. Now, what do they think about? This is the acronym that Homeland Security is focused on, these dangers. Chemicals, biologicals, radiological, nuclear, explosives, cyber, earthquakes, and storms. That's their list of concerns. If you wish to play in that field, you're going to have to explain how the issue of private land ownership contributes to addressing those issues. It's not hopeless. There are some ways, because here's the next step. What is it that they're looking at? Vulnerabilities and the consequences. And Homeland Security is looked at in terms of, kind of, besides people, two things. First is moms. Believe it or not, the Department of Homeland Security is trying to secure moms. Moms is maximum of maximums. They are moving away from looking at local events like tornadoes and a local hurricane and asking what's the worst that can happen. The new national security, national risk assessment will begin with something like a 10-kiloton weapon going off in a city. And that's their basis for analyzing how the federal government ought to play. So you need to think about how you contribute on that scale of things. Now look, here's an answer to that question, a place for you to start. This is all subdivided into areas of critical infrastructure. Remember, what am I doing up here? I'm giving you the language you need to play in this arena. The dangers, the concerns, the ability of the federal government to address Homeland Security issues is divided into areas they call critical infrastructure. What's a critical infrastructure? Transportation, meaning airports, seaports, medicine is a critical infrastructure. The generation and delivery of electricity is a critical infrastructure. Water and agriculture are critical infrastructure. Do you think and talk in those terms? People talk about food security, but you're talking about something much greater than that. You're talking about your connectivity to the community as a whole, your contribution to the existence of water, much less just securing it. Your contribution to the existence of the agricultural economy, the private owner's contribution to that. So these areas of critical infrastructure, that's your way in, that's your leverage. Anybody here a member of an Information Sharing and Analysis Center, an ISAC on agriculture? Well, that's how Homeland Security does business, is through the ISACs for the areas of critical infrastructure. And if you haven't heard the term, then you certainly can't be playing in their language on their field. Does that make sense? So you need to learn enough about how they view the world. What are the solutions? This is the way the Department of Homeland Security thinks about security problems. We have to, for those critical infrastructures, we have to prevent an event from taking place. Protect if an event does take place. A seawall in Galveston would be a protection measure. You can prevent terrorist attacks. You can't prevent hurricanes, but you can protect against them. Response is what happens in the short term thereafter. Recovery is what happens after that first 72 hours. Mitigation is how we prevent it from ever happening. So how do we prevent a flood on the Mississippi River? Pretty tough to prevent it, but we can certainly protect with levees. We can respond maybe by blowing one levee and flooding one area in order to save another area. Then we have to go in and recover. But what's really good is if we can mitigate by moving people out of the flood zone so we don't have all these problems to start with. That's mitigation. And finally, the hottest term in Homeland Security today is resilience. Resilience means coming back rapidly after an event. Now, why does that matter? Because the last term is the term they are using to identify resilience. After all this time, 10 years after 9/11, the federal government has discovered that there are more resources out here than they are in there. There's more gasoline in the ground in Texas at gas stations and farms and private ownership than they could possibly truck in after an emergency. There's more control of watersheds locally than they possibly could exert at the federal level. And so this business of the whole of community effort, reaching out to see what's available locally and applying that to these questions, how do I prevent, protect, respond, recover, mitigate, or establish resilience to address that critical infrastructure, that's the meat of what's happening in Homeland Security. And then the last point is that all this is related. All this comes together. And so that's the piece that you need to think about for sustainment and cooperation. When Hurricane Ike hit Galveston and ran up the coast and knocked out a large part of Orange and Port Arthur, East Texas lost power. A huge swath of East Texas lost power for 10 days. They never felt a drop of rain. They never had a blow of wind. But the electrical infrastructure collapsed and imperiled them for 10 days. So what kind of other connectivity is there in the field of agriculture that you either need to worry about, think about to help them address at that level, or what solutions do you pose in the field of agriculture to help with national resilience? So that's your question. How do you create new concepts and contribution to these terms that they use? So that's my sort of bottom line to you. What cause and effect mechanism? What do you do? If we do X, then Y occurs. Using private ownership of land and management to contribute to solving these problems. If you want to cast private ownership and land management in security terms, if you want to play on the national field in the area of national and homeland security, then this is what you must master. I mean, there's a lot more to it, but if you get started in this slide, you're well down the road. Lastly, what can we do to do that? Because this is overwhelming. I mean, you're not going to go home and study all this tonight. You can support, you can begin to connect your organization with other organizations that do this. You can begin to have joint meetings with security and homeland security organizations. You know, and right here in the Capitol, well, not in the Capitol, but here in Austin, where the Department of Public Safety has the bunker where they control emergencies in the that take place within the state of Texas. They now have a private, a member of a private industry that sits at the table in responding to an emergencies. And they represent all industries. They represent the oil industry and Target and everybody, and they have connectivity, all of that. I wonder if there's anybody that deals with agriculture and private ownership that sits at that table. If you want to play in an emergency in the field of Homeland Security, you know, we had 20,000 cattle impaired after Ike. I think it was 20,000 was the, and as I recall, lost about 10,000, saved about 10,000. I wonder who was sitting at the table in the command center in Austin when that was unfolding. I'll bet you, well, I don't know. Maybe I ought not to bet, but you ought to be there. You ought to have somebody there. You need to think about education. You need to be thinking about the integration. One last point. How is cancer treated today? This is this is my final and most important point to you. How is cancer treated today? Let me tell you what we don't do. What we don't do is what we did with the land-grant colleges. We don't focus on if we just create engineers, if we just create specialists in agriculture, if we just establish ROTC, and then they all create their own worlds and operate independently. Cancer is treated by a team. I just had a daughter-in-law that's spent the last year and a half at MD Anderson. She has a team, not only an oncologist, she has a surgeon, she has a radiologist, she has a person, she was pregnant, she had somebody who was a specialist in natal care. She has a person that's a statistician. She has somebody that works on what she eats. It's treated with a team. And so what I'm suggesting to you is that you need to craft a team to address these security issues and be part of a team. Who else, what other organizations can you reach out to? Where else can you plant your papers that you write? Who else can you have meetings with? Create that connectivity. That's the way that I'd suggest you move forward in this field if you wish to play, if you wish to convince people that private ownership of public lands has a real role in the security of the nation, both abroad and at home. I think I'm right at my time. Maybe I can take one question, or maybe we can wait till later. What do you think? One question? I get this all the time. It's people are like, it's like the ad where his hair's blown back, you know, and oh, got ties like. Okay, so maybe you have to think about that a little while. But any issues about how in the world are we going to cast private ownership, agriculture, the importance of land, water, food and fiber, and national security and homeland security realm? Yeah, the question was, any thoughts about how we reach a immigration consensus, because that has homeland security implications, national security implications, and also has agriculture implications. Let me just tell you, you have to address three parts. I don't think you're ever going to get consensus. What you have to get is 51%, right? I mean, that's the answer. What constitutes victory? 51% in our system constitutes victory. Or if you want to avoid a veto, 60%. And you have to address immigration in three areas. You have to address it in the workplace. If you do not address it in the workplace, if you don't make it less attractive, then you're not going to solve the problem. And by the workplace, I don't just mean where people work. I mean, we're funding school, we're funding health care, we're funding lots of things that are attractors to people to come. And by the way, the primary way we get illegal immigrants is not crossing the southern border. The primary way is people who come in on a legal visa and overstay. That's the primary source of illegal immigration, because we make it attractive. Secondly, we got to address it at home. That's especially true in Mexico. You know, the Mexican elite abuses their people. People come here and put their kids in school and go to the emergency room because they can't put their kids in school in an emergency room in Mexico. That is the fault of the Mexican elite, which is a 1% ruling 99%. And thirdly, we have to address the border. There are lots of new and additional things we can do along the border. Last point, my greatest concern along our border is public corruption, the corruption of our public institutions. If you think $100 billion worth of product is crossing our border every year against the law and nobody saw nothing, you are mistaken.
You mentioned getting someone at the table to think about these issues. Are there open seats at the table?
You have to lobby for them, argue for them. Look, this is all about, from the very beginning, from my first slide, what I tried to suggest to you is you must think, my suggestion is you have done a great job in positioning yourself as an issue, in finding levers, and working with your elected officials. This is something else you can do, not something instead of. And the something else you can do is cast what you are doing in terms of the contribution to the nation. So you will get at that table, and by the way, it's only so big, and you only put so many people around it, and they're constantly looking for a way to kick somebody off that table. So who stays? The person that contributes. You know, the guy who's the director of emergency management for Walmart and Target, they need to be at the table because they have more resources in the state of Texas. You've got lots of resources to bring to bear in an emergency, and lots of kinds of emergencies. So yes, you need help from the state of Texas to fight wildfires. What do you bring to the table for the state of Texas in the area of wildfires? Yes, you need help in legislation to keep farms and to address water shortages. What do you bring to the table in that issue? What is your contribution? What is your connection to all these other areas of critical infrastructure? That's what I'm asking you to think about. And I'm not arguing you can do it in your seat here on the drive home. I'm suggesting today's the start point to begin thinking of those things in new and different terms, and then put some connective tissue into it over time. Does that make sense? Thank you very much.
We want to talk about land, in particular, the 168 million acres that we call Texas. And what I want to focus on is the fate, the division, the structure of the 142 million acres that are private farms, ranches, and forest lands. Now, if we were giving this presentation 5 years ago, we would have talked about the 144 million acres of private farms, ranches, and forest lands in Texas. So what I want to do is go over some of the recent trends in land use, talk about some of the relationships that we see there, what those relationships can teach us, and then lay out some lessons learned that might help us make some progress into the next decade and even into the next 25 years. In being able to conserve private farms, ranches, and forest lands, but with a purpose being the provision of those public benefits that we derive off of those lands, in addition to the obvious commodities that they produce and the security that they provide for our state and nation. And then I want to talk about some of those challenges and how we might be able to overcome some challenges. So here we are, state of Texas, looks like a paintball target. This is actually the nighttime illumination values if you were to be in a satellite over the state. And you can see the obvious splotches where you'd expect the splotches if you know the state. If we looked at our state over the last 10 years for which we have the most accurate data, so I'm going to go over a 10-year period in most of the things that I talk about with you here, this 10-year period. In order for us to get a gauge on trends, will be 1997 to 2007. Now, what I can tell you is that from 2007 to 2010, there are some differences. I'll point those out where we know about them. But then for most everything else, the trends have basically remained steady over the last 3 to 4 years. So we had 22% population growth in the state, so we increased by 4.3 million people. We will likely increase by another 5 to 6.5 million people by 2020. So over the next, best way to think about it is over the next 10 years, we're going to increase by at least 5 million. So what's the consequences of that, and what can some of the information that we've looked at on the land trend study tell us about the consequences for rural lands across the state of Texas? Well, there is a consequence. You just simply can't add more people and expect nothing to happen, obviously. Over that 10-year period of record, we had a net loss of 1.5 million acres of farms, ranches, and forest lands. Now, it's pretty much a permanent loss, so a one-way ticket, if you will, into being a Home Depot or a Walmart parking lot or a subdivision. 40% of that conversion were in our top 25 growth counties within the state. That top 25 of growth counties absorbed about 85% of our population expansion. So 10% of our land area, in essence, absorbed 85% of the population growth between 1997 and 2007, and the consequence was about 40% of the loss of rural farms, ranches, and forest lands. By the way, the area that we lost was an area the size of Bexar County, plus Travis County, plus Rockwall County, which is a little bitty county up in North Texas. And so it's a fairly substantial area. So that 85% of the population growth that we absorbed in those 25 high-growth counties, 40% of our rural land loss. So just in those 25 counties, we lost an area about the size of Harris County. So about the size of metropolitan Houston was gone over that 10-year period, just in these 25 counties. So there's a data point. If, in fact, these land consumption rates continue, we will lose another 270 acres per 1,000 new residents over the next 10 years, if in fact the patterns of development and the patterns of land consumption over the next 10 years are the same as they were in the 10-year period that we looked at here. So, on the average, across the state, in those high-growth counties, we lose about 270 acres per 1,000 new individuals coming in, and that's a handy way to begin to look at what some of the potentials are, because we have very good demographic estimates of where our population expansion is going to be, but we also have real spatially explicit estimates of what this land consumption rate is. So let's look, for example, at our two most crowded metropolitan areas, so the Houston metropolitan area and the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area. We end up having about 100, they're very similar in their land consumption rates, somewhere between 180 and 190 acres lost to development for every 1,000 new residents. Let's look at another area. So let's look at Travis County and Bexar County. Combined, because they're about the same in their patterns, we lose 280 acres per 1,000 new residents. Now let's look at something that's interesting, which is the I-35 corridor growth area, and you take those 5 counties that are high-growth counties that are adjacent to Bexar County and Travis County, and let's exempt Bexar County and Travis County from the calculation, and just look at those high-growth counties that are adjacent to Bexar County and Travis County, and we lose 559 acres per 1,000 new residents in those high-growth expansion counties. So, message there, where we grow is critically important in projecting what our land consumption rates will be going into the next couple of decades, and whether we use land in the same way as we add a new unit of people, if you think of a unit of people as being 1,000. So here's again our nighttime illumination model that shows some of those growth areas that we had over that period. Here's another area in the state where we get a really high expansion up in northeast Texas, and in the Tyler Longview area we end up with about 545 acres lost per 1,000 new residents. So with current rates of land consumption, the high growth areas, if in fact we grow the way our state demographer projects we will grow in those high growth areas, and if in fact our land consumption rates stay the same, so there's 2 assumptions there, if in fact our land consumption rates stay steady in those areas, then we will lose likely another 1.4 million acres of farms, ranches, and forest lands between now and 2020. So, what this means, though, when we look at the variability in those land consumption rates, is that it matters critically what we do as far as policy decisions are concerned, so that, for example, if we do some things that pushes development out of major metropolitan areas, let's say out of Houston into the high-growth areas outside of Houston, or out of San Antonio, Bexar County, and those high-growth counties around there, we could likely lose 3 million acres instead of 1.4 million acres. Or conversely, there may be some things that we can do, for example, in creating more profitable landscapes near these high growth areas by paying landowners for those ecosystem services and those public benefits that those lands provide that make those lands less susceptible to development, and we might actually end up with less of a loss as we look into the future. Now, quite likely we're still going to continue to have some loss of rural farms, ranches, and forest lands, but our idea here is not to do away with people. Our idea here is to figure out how we can sustain our agricultural productivity and our state's economic infrastructure. So, this is my people are like grizzly bears slide. So the way to think about this is here's the ownership size distribution across the state of Texas. Now, if you look up in the upper left-hand corner, those are the proportions of the landscape that are made up by those ownerships that are less than 100 acres in size. So those farms, ranches, and forest lands where the ownership is less than 100 acres in size. Those that are bright green, that means there's a lot of them. When it's maroon or red, that means there's not very much of them. So we can see that it pretty much follows our rainfall pattern. So our principal and primary distribution of ownership sizes was established basically when Texas was still in an agrarian land use phase. In other words, we settled our land in a way that made sense from a net primary productivity perspective. Like a grizzly bear, if there's not very much productivity out there, we take a lot of space. Okay, so in the Trans-Pecos, in order to sustain an operation, tens of thousands of acres. In Deep East Texas, in order to sustain an operation, maybe 100 acres, right? So, like a grizzly bear, our range contracts and expands given the net primary productivity of what's adjacent to us. Now, one of the things that's been interesting and predictable over time in the state of Texas is that we went through the same phases that all other very highly developed areas go through. We went through the transportation phase, so we came out of our agrarian phase, went into this industrial phase where we relaxed those net primary productivity constraints. Now I'm dipping off into, I'm a wildlife biologist, so I turn everything into that, but we dipped away from that and began to think and began to settle lands dependent upon the transportation infrastructure, so we relaxed those constraints. And then more recently, in fact, over the last 15 to 20 years, we've come into more of an information phase, if you will, so that the means for gaining resources, the means of wealth, were not necessarily dependent upon local net primary productivity, nor were they really dependent upon regional net primary productivity. It was really completely relaxed the constraints that resulted in what we have as our primary feature across the state of Texas as far as ownership size is concerned. This is an artifact. This is an artifact of our agrarian phase. So if you look over there at those ownerships that are greater than 2,000 acres in size, East Texas, not very much of them. West Texas, Trans-Pecos, a lot of them. So that our net primary productivity bent in that agrarian phase explains why this pattern is there. But what has happened over the last decade or two really can't be explained by net primary productivity and our relationship to the land from a strict productive perspective. But nevertheless, there's still a relationship out there, and a relationship that critically matters, that has to do with size, and that's ownership size. And we talk a lot about fragmentation, why fragmentation's bad and this type of stuff. We need to put some real meat behind that, why we need to pay attention to ownership size. Does size really matter? And if size matters, then we have some reason and rationale to put some meat behind a program that can maintain size of ownerships. And if we maintain size of ownerships, then we can also maintain profitability, and if we maintain profitability, then we can perhaps stave off some of the loss of rural farms and ranches. So let's look at a productivity curve, and this is ownership size along the bottom axis, and then along the vertical axis, looking at the proportion of ownerships in that size category that were profitable. Okay, now this is during a single year, but it's a pretty good idea because it's across 142 million acres of the state. So those ownerships that were greater than 2,000 acres in size, for example, had about 62 to 63% or a 0.62 probability of being profitable if your ownership was that size. If you were really small, not so much, right? Not so much. All right, another reason or thing about size, and size matters. We vary in the amount in the blue line there. You've got the number of full-time farmers and ranchers, those people that full-time are stewards of that land, and full-time have the interests of their lives completely 100% aligned with the profitable interests of that land, so that they're paying attention. They're paying attention to the dollars and cents. 75% of those ownerships that are greater than 2,000 acres in size, on the average across the state, 75% of those landowners are full-time farmers or ranchers. Smaller sizes, not so much. In fact, you get below about 260 acres, and it's less than 40%. Now, what surprises me is we've actually got some people that have really, really small places that claim to be full-time. So, you know, something like 26 or 27% of ownership sizes that are less than 40 acres in size claim to be full-time farmers and ranchers. I'm not sure what they're growing, but they're, and also, if you look on that red line, the incidence of residing on those properties and those smaller properties is actually higher. So size matters for this reason. Now, size matters also for, you know, magnitude of profitability. So if we look at ownership size across the state on a amount of net profit per acre, really small ownerships losing on the average up to $150 to $200 per acre. That's hard to make up, and that's hard to justify unless, good thing, you're operating a small acreage ownership, right? If you're losing that much per acre. Only when you get up above 140 acres do we even have a on the average greater than zero net profit for ownerships across the state. And then it gets up on the average greater. Now keep in mind, we're talking about everything from cows to cotton in this calculation here. Okay, let's look at some shifts over that 10-year period in ownership size distribution. And I'm going to depend upon your knowledge of the ecological regions of the state of Texas, and I'll point some of those out here in just a second for those of you that might not be completely familiar with them. But we've got two patterns, basically, and I'm only going to refer to 4 ecological regions here because they represent those two patterns that we have, and then we'll look at some other data here in a minute that will bring the whole state into clearer view. If we look in the high plains, what we have on the far right axis there is an indication that we had consolidation over that 10-year period. In other words, we gained somewhere in the neighborhood of 750,000 acres of ownerships that were greater than 2,000 acres in size. What that means in blue-collar language is we ended up consolidating smaller ownerships into larger ownerships. About 750,000 acres, 750,000 acres in the high plains got aggregated into bigger ownerships over that 10-year period. Something happened that created that pattern in the high plains. Can't really explain all of it, but there's something that explains it because it was a pattern. Likewise in the Blackland Prairie. Now, both of these areas are dominated by croplands, those of you that know the state. Now, let's look at South Texas and the Edwards Plateau and bring your attention to those ownership sizes that are greater than 2,000 acres in size again. So the far right bar, a loss in South Texas of about 250,000 acres of large ranches. In the Edwards Plateau, 1.2 million acres of large ranches that was lost to fragmentation during that 10-year period from 97 to 2007. Now, there's some indications that not only has this fragmentation trend continued, but there's a couple of data points that might suggest it's actually accelerated. And I'll show you those in just a minute. So anyway, if we look on the left-hand side here, we can see what that fragmentation pattern is across the state. If we map those areas of the state where large ownerships broke up versus those areas of the state where large ownerships were accumulated, we can see that there's a pattern in the high plains and then a pattern throughout West Texas, the Edwards Plateau, and South Texas, some over in East Texas, and then over there in the Blackland Prairies, central part of the state. For those of you that don't know, is the Blackland Prairies, and so we've got some consolidation in there. And we've got those areas labeled on the far right map. So everything is red. Those ecological regions that are in red are largely fragmented over that 10-year period. Those that are in green largely consolidated. And in fact, if we look at Texas and the ownership size distribution changes over that 10-year period and just averaged it all together, you'd look down there and go, well, gosh, we didn't lose hardly any large ownerships because it pretty much averaged out. But there's some areas of the state where we continue, apparently, to even go down to smaller ownership sizes. So I've borrowed some data here. I borrowed it, of course, all of this is borrowed data, but I borrowed more data from the Real Estate Center at Texas A&M and drug out the median ownership size, the median tract size of real estate sales, and just pulled it out for the 1980, 1990, 2000, and 2010. And just looking at it for the hill country in South Texas, because that was one of our fragmenting areas, if you will, from that 10-year period. So now we're looking at it over a longer period. We're looking at it over 4 decades. And look at the hill country. So we went from average tract size that was sold in the hill country in 1980 of about 145 acres. That was the average, not average, the median tract size. Now the median tract size is 58 acres. 58 acres in 2010. Likewise, in South Texas, we went from pretty stable and, in fact, arguably increasing tract size between 1980 and 2000, and then that tract size was cut in half by 2010. Now, 2010 was a weird real estate year for those of you that know real estate in Texas, because we were coming out of, or hopefully coming out of, our economic slump. So it may be that smaller ownerships were selling while larger ownerships were just languishing on the market. So that's one explanation, but there's all kinds of explanations and speculations, but data don't lie, right? So here's some other things to look at, though, when we look at the comparison across the other two regions that were consolidating regions. So this is a completely independent data set. We look at the panhandle of Texas, where the High Plains is, and we really had stable tract sizes as far as median sales. A little bit of a dip in 2010, likewise in the Rolling Plains, so that West Texas that wasn't the Trans-Pecos. Now, just for fun, let's look at the Trans-Pecos. Let's look at the Trans-Pecos, and I didn't put the Trans-Pecos on these because the acreage sizes are so small, it just dwarfs everything else. Trans-Pecos, ownership size. Median ownership size, median tract size sold, I'm sorry, not ownership size. Median tract sizes sold during those 4 10-year periods went from over 10,000 acres as the median tract size, so the ranch size that was sold in the Trans-Pecos, went down to 6,000 acres, kind of stabilized in there, about 7,000 acres. 2010, less than 2,000 acres in size. Now, there's where that explanation may come in as far as the market simply not being able to absorb large ranches as far as purchases are concerned. But nevertheless, this is an independent data set that points to some of the same things that we were seeing in our land fragmentation data as far as these tract sizes for lands that are sold. Now, this is kind of out on the periphery, lands being bought and sold. To be sure, we still have plenty of large ownerships in the state. It's all is not lost. We still have plenty of large ownerships in the Trans-Pecos, in the Edwards Plateau, in South Texas. But there's some things that we could perhaps do and take some cues from what happened in other areas where either the policies or the economics as far as profitable land management were concerned that actually stimulated land consolidation as opposed to land fragmentation. So here's just to sum this up. We consolidated a little over 2 million acres during that 10-year period from 97 to 2007, and then we fragmented about 3 million acres during that same period. But it was in different parts of the state, so there are different situations. So there's some things we can probably learn from that. Let's look at land values. In 2007, and you can these are land values that come from the central appraisal districts. So there's flaws in there because the central appraisal districts at times will underappraise lands, but there's still a pattern, right? It's pretty easy to look up here and see, by George, the land values in Houston, San Antonio, Austin, and Dallas-Fort Worth, and then in the areas around there are higher, and that's what you'd expect. And so no real problems there if you look at this as an index and consider that on the average these are appraised at least equivalent, all things equal. Okay, changes from 1997 to 2007, and just what some of the changes held in store for us. Let's look at what those changes were divided up into our ecological regions. The High Plains, there was only about a 35 to 40% increase in appraised values during that period. But in the Edwards Plateau, we had almost a 250% increase in appraised values in the Edwards Plateau. Okay, let's just take these two ends of the spectrum and then consider that anything in between is going to be a gradient. Let's look at from 1966 to 2010, just one of those hot areas in the Edwards Plateau, so Barnett, Llano, Gillespie, and Mason counties. And in that area, we can see that, sure enough, we had a huge spike that started in about 1994. Still, perhaps, is not done with. And again, this is from the real estate centers, and these are size adjusted price per acre. So almost $6,000 per acre, up from about $1,000 per acre in 1994. But then let's look up here in the High Plains, in just this Square County area, where all the counties are exactly the same size and same shape, and really not so much of an identifiable trend upward that entire time. And in fact, for what the economists call the real values actually decrease. So when you adjust it for inflation, the value of land in the High Plains actually decreased when adjusted for inflation over that time period. Now I'll go back and if we look at our Edwards Plateau example, that red line, which is that one that's adjusted for inflation, increased, in fact, increased quite a lot. So it's likely the amenity values in the Edwards Plateau, those things that we all know make that area important for a lot of people, but rural farmers and ranchers can't capture. So there's an importance value out there that we all know is there. It's somehow providing public benefit. It's water recharge. It's sometimes aesthetic values, just open space. Other times it's the biodiversity and other ecosystem services and recreational services that those properties provide that aren't related to the net primary productivity of that ground that has resulted in that spike in prices. So here's our challenge. I've got about 7 minutes left here. We've got to figure out how to minimize per capita land consumption. That's just, someone's got to say that out loud. We're going to get more people, okay? We got to figure out how not to lose 500 acres every time we get 1,000 people. We just got to figure that part out. We got to do it in a way where we're working on the landowner side so that we're efficiently creating policy solutions that safeguard that land from high levels of consumption. So by creating something that competes with that demand for sprawl, if you will. We've got to figure out how to reverse the fragmentation trends. These may be different tools that do these two things right here. So reversing the fragmentation trends, and we've got to figure out how to stabilize land ownership in the state. So our real challenge is just exactly what we have here. And if we're to maintain the capacity to produce all the renewable resources needed to sustain a prosperous economy in Texas and our contribution to the nation's economy. In fact, we're the 12th largest economy on the globe if you look at it from a GDP perspective. We got to figure out how to do a few things better than we've done them in the past. And so we need some new incentives. Here's 4 or 5 things, perhaps not worded in the way an economist would word them, but worded in the way that a wildlife biologist might word them, that we need to do. We got to develop some standard measures. Now, these build on each other. We've got to develop some standard measures that reflect the resource outputs from private lands. And these must be accurate and reliable. We've got to be able to depend upon those measures so that we know when we say something's produced, it's accurate, it's reliable, it's the same every time. We've got to refine our management and conservation investment model so that we get a higher return on investment. And in fact, so that we actually look at return on investment for our limited conservation dollars so that we can prioritize. So when there are public monies available, we can assure the public that the best return on investment is being sought, that it's not just an ad hoc process in investing those conservation dollars. We need to establish secure ownership rights over the resources that we value from private lands. This is controversial, but there's only two alternatives the way I see it. We can either lose those values, or we can create a whole new set of command and control regulations. But we already know from experience, and we don't have to try it again, that harsh command and control regulations basically result in the same thing that in the acceleration of the same thing that we've seen over the past decade: higher fragmentation rates, landowners selling, and division of properties and depending upon other resources. We've got to create markets and market-based systems, new institutions that are supported by profitable land management. And that profitable land management needs to come from those very values that we can't measure right now, or we don't have good measures for, but are valuable to the public. And we need to create policies that then stimulate investments in private lands conservation. And they have to be investments that go beyond the excellent programs we have in philanthropy and the government programs that use taxpayer money to pay into conservation programs. We've got to make conservation pay from a business perspective, which is the only way to make it sustainable. That's my story.
Well, Dr. Wilkins, based upon the trends that you were showing there with regards to ownership size, and particularly with regards to agriculture, with profitability, and just in general your presentation, how important, in your opinion, is it that we have ag valuation for property taxes in the state of Texas for agricultural lands?
Well, that's an excellent question. So ad valorem taxation for agricultural use it basically means that we're taxing landowners on a use value instead of a conceptual value if they were to monetize their lands. And the bottom line is it would be absolutely catastrophic for the state of Texas if we were to lose, from just an objective perspective, if we were to lose ad valorem taxation for agricultural use. The reason is that if you do the calculations on what that rate would be for those landowners, there's no possible way that we could have a majority of our landowners, particularly in those areas that are suffering high fragmentation rates as they are now, that would not be forced into subdividing that ownership and selling. And then you've got to think, okay, what then? If they subdivide and sell, who's going to buy once they realize the story, if you will, that now ad valorem taxation is not going to be allowed for agricultural use? We would likely see decreasing property values, right? Because that's factored in. So to me, I can't imagine anything that would hurt one. If you wanted to destroy the rural infrastructure of the state of Texas in one fell swoop, that's what you do, you know.
You touched on it, and it's about the regulatory, not just regulatory atmosphere, but regulations and their impact on land use,
Right.
land values and such. And it's, we're sort of touching on it, but, I hope that at some point, I'd like to see, a little bit more background, a little bit more information.
I'm going to get more specific?
Yes.
Okay. What the fear would be? Well, let's take...
Fears, yes, because I know that's certainly, a part of it. But what is happening? How is regulation, what are the regulations that are impacting land values and land uses and land changes, these
Okay.
trends that you're discussing? Thanks, Neil.
All right, now let me just compare two things, and then and I don't know if it'll answer your question or not, but it's two ways of doing business, right? And let's take water, for example. Let's take water quality and water quantity. Right now, we could try to figure out how to get those metrics out there for private land so that we could figure out how to incentivize private landowners to produce water. In the tail end of this drought, we've got to figure that out. Okay? We're a state that uses 14 billion gallons of water a day. If you were to put that in a swimming pool, that swimming pool would have to be 50 foot by 50 foot, and it would be 35 miles deep. That's how much fresh water we use in a single day. By 2060, we're going to use 4 billion gallons per day more. So we've got to figure out how to incentivize private landowners to do that. Now, we could punish them into doing that. So, for example, we could expand the authority that the EPA has through the Clean Water Act so that the navigable waters of the United States would include essentially all waters, so that we could have EPA having regulatory authority over the waters, all waters. Thereby, we could then centrally command and control what people are using, hoping to come up with some kind of result there. Now, if we look at those two scenarios, knowing what we know about incentives and people's response to incentives and landowners' behaviors, perhaps rightfully so, which one of those is doomed for failure and which one of those might be destined for success?